6 feet in diameter and 65 feet tall. So the Parthenon was a quarter of the size of the temple of Artemis in the city of Ephesus. That is hard to grasp. And so a person named Paul comes into the city of Ephesus after the pre-evangelism of people like Aquila and Priscilla, Apollos, and notice in the beginnings of what becomes a huge city disturbance with Demetrius, who's a silversmith building shrines to Artemis. Then in Acts 19, verse 26, when Demetrius is talking to his tradesmen about what is going on in the city of Ephesus, he says, "Men, you know we receive a good income from this business, and you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that man-made gods are no gods at all. There is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty." And of course, you see what the great disturbance that you read the rest of Acts 19. With that in mind, I want you to come back to our epistle, 1 Timothy chapter 1. And this is where we left off 2 weeks ago. And thank you, Willie, for teaching last Sunday. We mentioned that earlier. I want to go back to 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 5 and 6, where Paul addresses Timothy, and he says unequivocally, "For there is one God and one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for all men, the testimony given in his proper time." Christianity is clearly inclusive and it's exclusive. It is both. It is inclusive in that this is a message for everyone. As you look in the preceding verse, that God's will is He wants all men to be saved, in verse 4, and to come to a knowledge of the truth. So this is a message that is for everyone. Just like John 3:16, "For God so loved the world." Right? But at the same time, it's exclusive. It is a knowledge of the truth. And what is the truth? There is only one God. And we've seen in 1 Timothy those doxologies, like if you look in chapter 1, verse 17, "Now to the King, eternal, immortal, invisible, being what? The only God, the honor and glory forever and ever." If you go back to chapter 6, and you see another doxology, the Song of Praise, he says in chapter 6, verse 16, that God, the blessed and what? Only ruler, the King of kings and Lord of lords. So when you look at chapter 2 again, verse 5, there is one God. They're not a pantheon of different gods and goddesses. And is it any wonder why there's such a great disturbance that goes all through the city of Ephesus? Because someone like Paul, Apollos, Aquila, Priscilla, and all these people who become Christians through their influence, they are teaching and believing there is only one God, monotheism. It's not polytheism. Of course, there's a Jewish synagogue in Ephesus as a Roman colony. So you have people becoming Christians who are both Jewish in background, and then of course those who have a polytheistic background. So Christianity is the concept that there is only one God, and as we all know, we all breathe by the grace of God. At any one moment, both God and man. There's only one God, he says, and one mediator between God and men. And appropriately, that person who is the mediator is uniquely qualified because he is fully deity and he is fully man. He is, the emphasis is the man Christ Jesus. If you want to really, explore that further, just read the book of Hebrews. And that whole book is about, this priestly responsibility that Jesus has as the mediator between God and men. So, in the ancient religions, you would appease the gods or goddesses. You would basically get them off your back. So that's why you see the sorcery that you read about in Acts 19 earlier to the servants with Demetrius and his trade. When you read the book of Ephesians, you're dealing with all these celestial higher powers, principalities, authorities, and that because of the resurrection that Jesus is supreme over any and all powers. So there is only one mediator. Jesus himself said, I am the way, I'm the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but what? Except through me. He's the only mediator. And, in a society like we live in, it is so pluralistic. There's a repulsive reaction of people in our culture because we have left, our Jewish Christian moorings, and that, Christians are verbally accosted and persecuted because of this belief that there is only one way to God. There are more people in our country who are followers of Hindu than members of the Churches of Christ. Not just our faith, tradition, heritage, but there are more Muslims than members of the Churches of Christ. Our country, when you travel and you go places, it used to be where you would go to, the San Francisco, New York City. We took our granddaughter to Gatlinburg back in July. She's 16, and I honestly, I wasn't prepared to see how many people were of the Islam faith all around me. And it's just a different world that we live in. It's a different Tennessee we live in. And yet at the same time, from Paul's perspective, he's not intimidated. He goes to the city of Ephesus, and there's a clear, distinct message. And what is that message? There's one God. And there's one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus. He's not ashamed of that message. And he proclaims it. And yes, he suffers because of it. But does that mean, because you have this inclusive view that there is truth, that you're exclusive? No. It's both and. You believe this message is for everyone. Everyone can be saved. And so this is a message that, yes, is conditional, just like in John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that what? That whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. So God loves each and every one of us all the same, whatever your religion or no religion, whatever nation or ethnic group you come from, whatever the color of your skin, whatever your gender is, God loves each and every one of us the same. But there's only one way to be saved, and that's through the Lord Jesus Christ. And why? Because he gave himself as a ransom for how many? All men, right? The word there is anthropos. It's the generic for all men. That he gave himself as a ransom for all men. Just as Jesus said in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, death was to pay the price for our redemption. That he ransoms us. He was paying the redemption fee. And you and I are of infinite worth to God. That the reason that God came to the earth in the person of Jesus Christ is to die on a cross, to pay a ransom for all men, every one of us, because every one of us is equal in one's worth before God. We are worth saving, right? That's the good news. We preach, proclaim every Sunday. He gave himself as a ransom for all men, the testimony given in its proper time. So, yes, it's exclusive in the sense that there's only one way, but it's inclusive in that everyone can be saved. It's good news. Is this a belief that's worth dying for? If you believe that it is the truth, it's worth not only dying for, but living for. And that's what Jesus has called all of us in our commitment. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. So, Paul says, for this purpose, I was appointed a herald, an apostle. I'm telling the truth, I'm not lying, and a teacher of the true faith to the Gentiles. And as we've seen, when you look at chapter 2, verses 1 through 8, that Paul is reminding Timothy to tell the Ephesians. I mean, he's already given all these instructions to Timothy, but he's reminding him. He's written a letter. And 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, a similar letter like Titus, that this is how you pray, to whom you pray, and why you pray. And all that's in verses 1 through 8. So let's go to verse 8. I want men, and I want you to stop for a minute. Something interesting happens all of a sudden. When you're looking at verses like 1 Timothy 2, 5, and 6, it's generic. Anthropos. Men. There's mediated between God and men, and even the generic word for Christ, man, who gave himself as a ransom for all men. But when he gets to verse 8, he changes his word, and it's the word exclusively for men, and there. He says, I want men everywhere to lift up holy hands in prayer without anger or disputing. So, again, as he's writing in these first verses 1 through 8, whom they pray to, why they pray, how they pray, but now it's emphatic, and it's a contrast, as you'll see as you come into verse 9. He's talking now addressing men and women. So, the men were praying with bad attitudes. They're praying, all right, but when they're praying, it's quarrelsome, agitated, disputing, that they are in anger. It's like they're just, got their fist. You ever been in a church service where a man prayed in anger and a quarreling spirit? Well, I've seen it. He starts with, you've got some problems over there. It starts with the guys. It's the men we need to start with. And when they pray, you need to instruct them in what way? Remember what our purpose statement is in this opening? Go back to verse 2 when he's talking about praying for those in authority, like the kings, those in authority, that we may live peaceful and what? Quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. Paul says when we come together, that we want to have in our times together, and how Christians are known, that we live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. And that's not what's happening with the men. That they are leading to disturbance in the way that they're praying. And again, you know, we've said and mentioned this, but you know, it's like when you're listening to somebody on a telephone, you know, like I'm listening to, I just go through the room, I'm not snooping, but Marla's talking to her sister yesterday. I hear what she's saying to her sister, but I don't know what her sister's saying to her. But I can splice it back in my mind by what Marla's saying, what's going on. And that's a lot of times what we're having to do when we're reading Scripture. We know what Paul says to Timothy, but it's very hard sometimes to get all the, the historical reconstruction, what it all is going on. But we can walk away with how we are to have the right attitude. And that attitude is we want peace. We want quiet. And these guys are displaying bad attitudes of anger and quarreling when they pray. And then he moves on and he says, I also want women. So it's not just the men, it's women. It's like, all right, everybody's going to be included in this sermon today. This is going to be a lesson for everybody. So the men got some issues they need to be taught. And good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. My roommate when I was in graduate school was just a remarkable guy. And we're good friends to this day. We got together for lunch a couple of months ago in Frank Ewing at 64 and 65 and just talked for hours after all these years. And I remember when we were in school together, we're guys, so we're talking about the girls and, in our Christian Student Center. And he made a statement I have never forgotten. He said, Steve, beauty is only skin deep. And he had a pause and he said, but skin is important. He was dating Marla at the time. And here, what has happened in their assemblies, their times together, is that when Paul's using this word modest, it's not like maybe I grew up hearing sermons, about modesty, about underdressing. This is the opposite problem. This is overdressing. And Paul's addressing a lot of, in 1 Timothy, about there are a lot of wealthy Christians in their midst. And so what you're seeing going on is that this is in reference to clothing that is very expensive and extravagant. The women in the assembly were drawing undue attention to themselves. So it ends up being more like when they're coming, it's showing off their social prominence and that they're really well-to-do, okay? And it's not like we're not familiar with wealthy women who become followers of Jesus. I mean, Lydia is how the church starts in Philippi in Acts 16. But apparently there's a lot of wealthy, noble women in the church. And where's the thrust here is that where does your true adornment come from? It's within. That a good worship of God is not ostentatious. This is not, to the extreme in our culture, like, the Oscar nights where all the women are parading. We don't need this when we come together. Women need to be dressing appropriately and, the emphasis is making your life beautiful. And it's almost like verbatim. If you read 1 Peter 3, verses 1 through 7, it's almost exactly the same thing. I mean, Peter, as the apostle, says, how women are to adorn themselves, and it should be on the inside. But, we all, it's like you can take anything to an extreme, like Jesus says to Satan, man should not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. You still need bread, right? And that's the same thing that you see here, is that obviously we all have clothing and we need to be dressed, but we just need to realize what's most important. As Peter says in 1 Peter, the inner quality of a quiet spirit, and that's the same word that Paul uses here in 1 Timothy. We live peaceful and quiet lives. So, the true dormant is the Christ-like character. And then what you're waiting for is verse 11, right? Everybody woke up this morning and said, verse 11 and 12 is coming today. So we're going to get there. I'm going to watch the time, and he goes on. He's talking with women in particular, but he's addressing Timothy about how he is to be instructing them, and a woman should learn. I just want to stop there a moment. A woman should learn. That sounds like an imperative to me. Marla loves to watch movies from the 40s and 50s. I'm still hanging around in the 70s and 80s, you know. And the other day, I was going through my queue. Excuse me. And I saw a movie that I hadn't seen in 40 years ago called Yentl. Have y'all ever seen the movie Yentl? Yeah. Barbara Streisand grows up in Eastern Europe. Her father's a rabbi, and she loves reading the Bible and the Talmud. And her father dies, the rabbi. And so she cloaks herself, dresses as a man, and goes off to rabbinic school to learn the Talmud. Because she wants to learn. And Paul is telling Timothy, a woman should learn. But how? A woman should learn, he says, in quietness and full submission. And that word quietness, again, is the same word we saw back in verse 2. It is the same word that I made reference to in 1 Peter 3, verse 4. It means to have a quiet manner, a quiet attitude, a quiet demeanor. My brother and I, my youngest brother and I, do a lot of hiking together and cycling together. I'm 12 years his junior, so I'm his oldest brother. So I story tell him a lot because he doesn't know a lot of things about our family. Sometimes he'll stop when we're hiking and it's like he's in a daze and I forget that he doesn't know this. But he told me one time, we were talking about the kids, which all of us are, all my siblings have grandchildren. And he was telling me about when his daughter planned to get married, and I did the wedding ceremony several years ago, that he had a talk with her about getting married and what it involves about being married, obviously, with a man. And his message to her, my niece, what is it that a man needs? And my brother said, Olivia, what a man needs is peace. When he comes home, he wants quiet. He wants peace. He wants tranquility. And it's like what Paul is saying here, that a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. Women are to learn with a quiet demeanor. Now, in a Jewish synagogue, women were not allowed to speak. And on the other extreme, women who had a background in Ephesus, who were worshipers of Artemis, with all those priestesses with the armors, they had a prominent role. So imagine having to splice a church where you've got people from a Jewish background who never spoke in the synagogue. Aquila and Priscilla took Apollos to their home, remember? In Acts 18. And then you've got all these, women priests with Artemis, and you've got all these people in one church, and Paul is telling Timothy a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. So the women in the assembly are not to create confusion by what? By an insubordinate conduct to the teaching authority of men. They are to learn in quietness and submission. Paul is describing a quietness of demeanor. And he goes on to say in verse 12, I do not permit, that's strong language, I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be, the NIV says silent. It's the same word again, quiet, hesychia. So Paul's already used this word 3 times. Quietness. So, when you look at 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1, it says, here's a trustworthy saying, if anyone sets his heart on being an overseer, she desires a noble task. He. The overseer must be above reproach the husband of one wife. Men only are to be the teaching elder or elders, or a minister of the gospel like you see in Timothy or Titus, that we call these the pastoral letters because they are being written to evangelists who have the authority to appoint elders and deacons, as you see in 1 Timothy chapter 3. So the men, like Paul, Timothy, Titus, have a teaching authority from God. That he's giving this directive. We, in our times of assembly, Timothy, cannot permit when you or Apollos or someone is preaching or teaching for a woman to end up having authority over you. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be quiet. The teaching in the early church was a special gift. You see that in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11. It's a gift. And teachers were comparable to like priests in the Old Testament. We think about priests as the ones bringing sacrifices, the intercessors, but they were also teachers of the faith to the people. Rabbis, obviously, as Jesus was a rabbi. And you see this all through the Old Testament. Timothy and Titus were commissioned. And you see that commissioning being referred to Timothy to be an evangelist and to have authority. And as we just noted, elders were men only in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 1 beginning. So the question becomes, does 1 Timothy 2 verses 11 through 14 exclude women from teaching men? When it talks about, I don't permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man, she must be quiet. Look at 2 Timothy chapter 1. And we're just going to start, and as time permits, and I'm sure it'll have to carry over to next Sunday, but I want to just start with the letters themselves. In 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, Paul, addressing Timothy, says, I have been reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice. And I am persuaded now lives in you also. Where did Timothy learn about God. His father was a Greek. Where did he learn? Mother and grandmother. All right? Look over in Titus, chapter 2. Another pastoral letter, but very similar. Where Paul tells Titus that is responsible about teaching the older men, beginning in verse 1 and 2. But then in verse 3 he says, likewise, teach the older women to be reverent in the way they live, not to be slanderers or addicted to much wine, but to teach what is good. Then they can train the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure, to be busy at home, to be kind, and to be subject to their husbands, so that no one will malign the word of God. So Titus is instructed, teach the older women, who in turn will train the younger women, and the Christian disposition and attitudes that they are to have. So, when you're thinking about something like 1 Timothy chapter 2, it doesn't preclude a woman teaching on a personal basis or in a home. And we made reference to Apollos, who comes to the synagogue in Ephesus, you know, on the second missionary journey. Paul brings Aquila and Priscilla with him, leaves them in Ephesus. Paul is there for a while, so he goes into the synagogue, and obviously he's doing direct teaching or pre-evangelism, if you will, but he leaves Aquila and Priscilla because he goes on to Jerusalem. And then Apollos comes, and he's teaching in the synagogue because Aquila and Priscilla are Jewish in their origin, and they hear Apollos, who knows everything about Jesus except what? The baptism of Jesus and what Jesus taught. He knew only the baptism of John. Who taught him? Aquila and Priscilla. They take him into their home and they teach him. We don't have the time, but I just when you're thinking, because like you, I believe when you're trying to find out what something means, you go from the immediate text, the code text, if you will, of all of 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, the pastoral letters, and then you've got the bigger frame. The woman at the well, when she discovers who Jesus is, what does she do? She goes and tells everybody in her village that Jesus is who? Messiah. When Jesus is raised from the dead, was it Peter and John or James who first proclaimed that Jesus has been raised from the dead? Who was it? It was the women. Okay? Paul is not ordering women to be quiet, to be silent. And the silent in 1 Corinthians 14 is a much stronger word than what you hear or see here. But that's another domain. But Paul is not ordering women to be silent in the home, in the marketplace, or in the street. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 28, 18 through 20, go make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and lo, I'll be with you always. Who's that command for? Everybody. So that is man and woman, adult and child, everyone who comes to know who Jesus is through a story like Matthew, that Jesus brings his original apostles to that mountaintop and gives them a worldwide vision. Go make disciples of all ethnic groups, all nations. And make disciples, baptize those, baptize disciple, and then do what? Keep teaching them, right? So that's a responsibility and accountability that we all have. When you come to, as I mentioned a moment ago, the situation in Corinth, before the bell rings, there were New Testament women who obviously had the gift of prophecy. Philip had how many daughters who had the gift of prophecy? The 4, okay? Spirit-inspired women who could give prophetic messages. You can read about those who could pray and prophesy, but with the responsibility to show a respectful and submissive manner, which is what was not happening in the church at Corinth. You read that in 1 Corinthians 11. In Acts 2, Luke quotes from Peter, who is quoting from the prophecy in Joel, that when the Holy Spirit comes, that when the Spirit comes, men and women will prophesy. And that's being fulfilled on the day of Pentecost. The message is for everyone. So, you know, clearly when you go to 1 Corinthians, the women were not being respectful and submission and a submissive attitude. They were to always have a head covering, a prayer, devotional covering when they met. I want you to do some homework. I want you to think before we get together next Sunday. What did the early church look like? And I don't say this to be negative. I just say that we don't really sometimes stop and think about how we are affected by things that we are just born into. I'm teaching a class, and there's all different ways we can teach class. Some teachers have question and dialogue. You know, I'm trying to get through the material a little quicker. You know, I'm just teaching and allowing an interaction later. We are organized. We're part of a Catholic Protestant heritage of 20 centuries. The early church did not own buildings. They met in homes. They met in catacombs. They met in tenement buildings. They met in apartments. We are affected by a heritage that has institutionalized Christianity in church-owned buildings, property, budgets, how we do church. And all of that, I'm not saying there's something, that there's intrinsically wrong with any of that. We're just shaped by a heritage, a tradition of how we do church. Say bye to Bill. But at 12 o'clock thereabouts, I'm going to be going into a small group. And I can tell you, it functions completely different than what happens when I'm teaching right now, or when Matthew's getting up and preaching, or what's going to happen in the next 15 minutes. Are we praying? We're praying. Are we teaching? We're teaching. Are we sharing? We're sharing. But it is different. We're obeying the one another commands, and it's done differently because it's in a home. It's more family. And I'm not suggesting for one moment that we're not family. We are family. It's just that Bible class has a heritage of the way we do Bible class. And church and worship on Sunday has a way of how we do what we do. And so where I want to come back to next Sunday is that I think why a lot of these things get so controversial is that we are trying to understand instructions given in a context that is 20 centuries removed from us. But what we do know, what we can walk away from is that men are to preside over times of prayer and teaching. That's what is unequivocally true when you read 1 Timothy. That before, and then I'm going to stop, before Paul says what he says, I want you to look at verse 7 again. That he is an apostle, I'm telling the truth, I'm not lying, and a teacher of the true faith to the Gentiles. So this person who is giving this directive, verse 11 and 12, a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. She must be quiet. That this is an apostle. This is a teacher of the true faith. This is a preacher. And his commission comes from God, and he is giving this commission to Timothy as his representative. This is the word from the Lord. And so that, we know, is supra-cultural. It transcends culture and time. So, we'll come back. I want you to be thinking, reading 1 Timothy 2, and you come with your questions. And I'm going to share some things that I've observed over years about how sometimes we take things to the extreme and how sometimes we just miss it. Time's up. We'll let you go.
Hi, Riker. How are you?
All right.
They're up there somewhere.